Hey, good day, and welcome to another episode of the OIG Roundtable. I'm getting better at remembering that it's the OIG Roundtable because I look at Matt, I look at Jason, I look at Wade, and I remember that they were all OIG guys. So I remember it's the OIG Roundtable versus the OIG Files or anything else with the letters OIG in it. And how many times can I say OIG in a sentence? But welcome. I'm back again. Matt Kachansky's here, retired executive from HHS OIG and the retired Northeast UPIC director, and now one of the managers over on our SIU team. Jason Eisengrind, also retired executive from HHS OIG and the retired Western UPIC director, and is now our special director in charge, working on special projects, proposals, and the like. Wade McFall, some will say Wade McFall, depending upon with whom you're speaking, retired assistant special agent in charge of the Los Angeles field office, and now one of our senior investigators on one of our Medicaid contracts. And we're bringing in a special guest today, and that special guest is Joe Croce, not an OIG guy, but very close. Joe, retired New York City police detective, spent 20 years in New York City on the streets of New York, then retired and has spent the past 20 years in the healthcare SIU space. And Joe, I got to say, for a guy who spent 20 years in the PD and then 20 years in the SIU space, it's unbelievable for a guy who's only 43 to have 40 years of experience. So Joe, welcome. Joe is one of the directors, is a counterpart to all of us here, and is one of our directors on our SIU team, and is intrinsically involved with the investigations and operational stuff, managing some of the 15 or 20 SIU contracts. Joe, let's just quickly give about a 2-minute on really your background, a little bit more than what I explained.
I was fortunate enough to land in a specialized white-collar crime unit within the NYPD called the Special Fraud Squad, and it was there that I started cutting my teeth on dock-in-a-box cases, not really delving into CPT codes and data mining, but more or less boot-to-the-ground type of investigations. After I retired in 2002, I was fortunate enough to get a job working for a large MCO in New York City, and that's where I pretty much cut my teeth on healthcare fraud, and been passionate about it ever since.
And there is a rumor that your license plate said what?
Fraud guy.
Fraud guy, exactly. So, I mean, you take the love of fraud, waste and abuse to another level. So, so what we want to spend the next, half hour or so talking about, one of the reasons that we brought you in, Joe, is because you have spent a lot of your career at large payers, on the internal payment integrity SIU side, and now you're one of the lead people helping to shape and grow our internal SIU team along with Matt and Wade and Jason. And as our SIU team internally grows, we've got about 15 or 20 different plans that we're doing either partial or full SIU work for. And we've really been talking over the past few podcasts about operational improvements, process improvements. And one of the things that comes to light in a lot of our discussions with payer plans that we deal with are process improvement, and even internally, is managing the sort of diverse population of investigators that come in. And it could be right out of college, some young college graduate who someone is giving an opportunity to learn and shape into the position, all the way through to people that came out of law enforcement like you, 20 years of law enforcement, maybe a detective at a police department, and they get into an SIU. I really do equate those two people, while they have two very, very different sets of experience, I do equate them in very similar ways, right? The fresh out of the box college grad is going to be computer savvy, know how to use Excel, be very good at using things like search engines and Google and the like, and technology, whereas someone who worked for 20 or 30 years in a police department, law enforcement capacity, may not have command of things like Excel or be good at doing things with search engines, and certainly don't know necessarily healthcare fraud. Two different groups, but very similar. And you've had experiences in interacting with both internally at our on our team, externally, and you yourself were kind of in that category. talk a little bit about those experiences and where in your current capacity and your former capacities, you've sort of seen where those strengths and weaknesses can be worked to become actual strengths all around.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. The guy coming from law enforcement might have the know-it-all to do any type of investigation, whether it's a homicide, burglary, robbery investigation, but it does not translate into doing healthcare fraud investigations, to be perfectly honest. There's a big learning curve there. And if you don't have the desire to learn Excel, how to do a pivot table, how to data mine the claims data, you're going to be lost in the world of an SIU. You have to be open-minded, willing to learn. And again, when we bring in the new persons, the interns, or the persons who are, in their early, 30s, even a younger person, they might not have the experience of knowing the schemes that are going on, but they have the savvy to run rings around anybody with an Excel spreadsheet, and they understand claims data, and they can probably even understand the CPT coding. But it's, do you know how to conduct an interview? Do you know how to speak to a provider and request an overpayment or negotiate a settlement? We're often tasked with speaking to the attorneys of these providers. And so you have to be comfortable with the topic and the subject matter in order to be able to present yourself well in these conversations.
Yeah, and I think that becomes a little bit of the challenge, right? Because you've got somebody who may have had 20 years of law enforcement experience, and that experience may or may not equate over, right? I mean, being able to do an interview is one thing, particularly a field interview, but being able to do an interview of Medicare or Medicaid or commercial beneficiaries and members may be very, very different, right? To, having to be able to throttle that sort of experience that you've got and gear it to the right thing. So Wade, I want to go to you now for a minute, because one of the things at HHS-OIG, we were around, Jason and Matt were around for a good chunk of this as well, was during some of the hiring surges that occurred at HHS, right? So the first really big hiring surge was in 1995 when HHS and Social Security split. And that was the first round of Operation Restore Trust. I was hired in the second round in 1997, and there were a whole bunch of surges after that. And I know that in each of those surges, you would get this kind of mix where you'd get people like me who came from I wasn't a special agent, I had a different law enforcement position, but I go into this criminal investigator job. But I know that over the years, when we had these big surges of hirings, we would get people from agencies that had a similar mission: DEA, FDA, OCI, sometimes Department of Defense IG, VA IG, agencies that did healthcare, and maybe agencies that didn't do healthcare. We'd get people from the FBI who were in other squads, and you wound up as an ASAC. You're now supervising what really is not dissimilar to what we were just talking about with Joe, this kind of mishmash of people. And you've got people who may have had 15 or 20 years of criminal investigative experience at the DEA, but they don't know anything about healthcare. As an ASAC, how would you have dealt in a supervisory capacity? Because whether you're a supervisor at an SIU or you're a supervisor at the OIG, those challenges are not dissimilar. How would you deal with those kind of challenges? You're on mute, Wade.
Rookie move. So anyways, can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. So yeah, depending on how many vacancies we'd have anywhere from, 25 or 30 applicants to, several hundred. So it was always kind of a game of weighing the pros and cons of, much like Joe said, of somebody coming right out of college versus somebody transferring. Early on, I started in LA in '93, and at that time, we didn't have a SAC, we had a RIG, a regional inspector general, and it was her kind of position that she liked molding people. So she liked the inexperienced right out of college that had a little bit more tech savvy. As the years progressed on and we hired more people, depending on who the SAC was at the time, that whole approach changed a little bit, and we started hiring more transfers from other agencies, but again, it would depend on what the applicant pool was like. But much like you guys said, if you can get an agent who's been with the Secret Service or IRS or Defense Criminal Investigation Service that have, the basic investigate. They've gone through like basic training. They have the basic investigative skills, but they really don't. It's completely different to try and work healthcare and specifically Medicare. So you might have an agent that you brought on from. We had quite a few that came over from the Secret Service, and then you're in the position of they're experienced, but they're not experienced in healthcare. So a lot of times, what we would do, a couple approaches, is to give them a mentor from somebody who's been around with HHS for a while, so they can help them through the Medicare specific and the CMS or the HCFA regulations back then. But also, I think it's important to, as people progress in their kind of learning the whole system, it's important to give them different types of cases. So, starting off early, I know you've said before, Eric, that like podiatry is kind of an entry-level case for a lot of agents. Somebody who just came on, whether out of college or coming from another agency, I'm not going to assign them to a Part A hospital cost report case because they're just too complicated for somebody. You have to have some experience for that. So between assigning mentors to help the newer people out, and then trying to, it's kind of a push-pull between giving them a variety of cases so that they can learn all the areas, but they're not going to learn everything because there's too much there in Medicare fraud. So it's a combination of giving them enough that they can learn quite a bit. But I would have agents who were my go-to if I had a big hospital case that was going to be big dollars and it was going to be press and all that stuff. I probably would be less likely to give that to somebody new who's learning versus one of my seasoned OG vet, people that have been around for a while that know that program inside and out.
Right. So if I'm hearing you, a little bit of it is going to be established manpower based, meaning if you've got a team of 15 really experienced investigators, then hiring someone who's new, where you can invest the time in training them up, is going to be maybe more beneficial than if you're either an immature SIU, meaning it's a newer SIU, or your investigators have a much lower amount of experience that you might need to bring in people who have a little bit less of that fresh blood. The other thing you mentioned, which is the mentoring, and at the OIG, the mentoring program was, at some point, it actually became a very formalized program. When I was a mentor, I had to go to a 3-day training program. They did a version of the Myers-Briggs personality test, so that when you got someone to mentor, it was someone who was similar to you. And I am a graduate of the Jason Eisengrein School of Mentoring.
We would all love to see your Myers-Briggs scores, Eric.
You really don't. If incorrigible is a score, then the answer is yes. But so I'm a graduate of the Jason Eisengrein mentoring program. And I've Jason has been one person that I've always said was very formative in my young career as an agent. But one of the things that Jason would always say is, I'm your guide. If you don't want to take my advice, you're kind of on your own, and then you're going to sink or swim. And nearly everything that I would give to Jason, he would say, you can either take this advice or not take this advice. I'm not your supervisor. And you're either going to, if you take my advice, you'll be okay. If you don't take my advice, you might be okay. And so the mentoring piece is really important, regardless of whether you've got 20 years of experience or not. When I was an agent at the OIG, I had a guy that I mentored who spent 12 or 13 years at another agency. He was a seasoned investigator, but had never done healthcare. He knew nothing about healthcare. And the unfortunate part is that he came in at a senior agent level, and we did that with a number of people. We had another agent who came in from Secret Service, and this particular agent's entirety of their career was in protective intelligence and on protectee details for a former president. They came over to the OIG as a senior agent. well, there's an expectation that they're going to be productive, and they are actually no more productive than a brandy new agent. So, that push-pull really does exist. So, Jason, I want to go to you because you ran, when you were at headquarters at the OIG, you were intrinsically involved in training. You mentored me, you mentored a lot of other agents in the New York region, and then went on and were the ultimate hiring person at the UPIC West, similar to Matt in the Northeast. And you've obviously got this push-pull that exists with levels of experience. How do you see the training and the hiring? Like, how does this all come full circle for you?
Well, since you brought up yourself as an example, let's stick with that for a moment. So when you first came on board, you had excellent skills. Your writing, your speaking, your ability to have analytical thoughts were excellent. But I think, and we've joked about it on occasions, but when we first started to go out and interview Medicare beneficiaries, I think that, there was a little bit of a look of surprise on your face because it was totally different than in your background of interviewing people for the U.S. Probation and, in a more traditional crime setting as opposed to a fraud. And now we have a witness to the fraud happening. So, our job as leaders, as business leaders, is to put programs into place that will mitigate that challenge and really leverage those great skills that people do bring when they come from another agency. So, one of the things, and this is a great conversation because it's frankly drawing on several podcasts that we've done in the recent weeks. And so one of the things is in terms of onboarding is to create a schedule of competency areas that need to be mastered. And early on, the mentor, the supervisor, the manager will, be able to assess that, oh yeah, these particular competency areas are already mastered. And I always like accountability. So the new person, as well as the mentor or whoever above that, wants to sign off on the fact that it's mastered. The other thing is that the program and that structure does allow for what I'm about to say, which is the program needs to be tailored to the individual. Because if you just follow every regimented thing in your procedure manual, and it's something that you've already, like, to spend the time with you back in the day of the mid 90s, talking about how to write a good report, a law enforcement related report, you need to tailor it that, yeah, this is the structure here, but basically it's the same concept. Bullet points, get to the point, third person writing, things that somebody right out of college might not know.
Yeah, that's a good point. And what I think you're alluding to in the mentoring is a little bit of like a checklist of activities to show competency. And, at the OIG, we use that when we had our formalized mentoring program. The goal was to get every one of those things checked off. And one of the jobs of the mentor was to make sure that the mentee had opportunities to do those things. For example, testify in the grand jury. Well, as a new agent, you may not have a case in which you can testify in the grand jury on your own case, but you can certainly find an opportunity where the U.S. Attorney's Office doesn't want the case agent to be the testifying agent. So a lot of it is coordination amongst other mentors, management, and things of that sort. And that really becomes, an important piece of it. The other thing too, which you brought up, is developing the ability to learn how to do interviews that are specific, or discussions that are specific to the thing. And one of the things, and we'll bring this back to Joe for a minute, but one of the things that Joe takes the lead on our SIU team is he takes the lead in working to negotiate the settlements with the providers and with the lawyers representing providers. Because in the SIU world, an overpayment is oftentimes not just the provider writing a check, right? They get a lawyer, there's a negotiation, and that is as much science, meaning what's the audit saying, and art, right? And so, Joe, you're doing that a lot, right? For a lot of our SIU clients, you're negotiating, and one of the things that you're really working on is getting some of our newer people who may be really good at investigating, but not really good at that piece of the puzzle. So you've been spending some time doing that, right?
Yeah, so I'll team up with an investigator who might not be comfortable even having a conversation with the provider to let them know that there's been an identified overpayment. And so I'll come on board and I'll assist the investigator, or I'll run the conversation with the provider or the provider's attorney, and basically spell it out for them. You really need a little confidence when you're having these conversations with these, especially the attorneys. So you got to make sure you do your homework, make sure you have the policies or the CMS regs or any other plan policies in place, so that you can say, as per this plan, as per this policy, for this line of business, you can't bill this way. And so there's been identified overpayment. So again, and you have to know, like you said earlier, we have different clients, different plans.
Right.
Some plans don't want you negotiating. They want the identified overpayment back. Some have a different tolerance for provider abrasion, and they're willing to sometimes just jump right to provider education. So you got to understand who your plan is, who the client is, and adjust your conversations with the attorneys or these providers as such.
Yeah, and that actually is a great segue to the next thing that I want to talk about. Matt, I want to go to you, and we're going to go back to Joe for kind of the final word before we close out. But one of the things that we are doing here is we're the outsourced SIU in part or in whole for about 15 or 20 different plans around the country. And those plans are everything from Medicaid, regional Medicaid plans, larger local plans, Medicare Advantage plans, and commercial plans. And so what Joe is really talking about, and Matt, I want to go to you because this is really that it's not a push-pull so much as it is managing the different expectations and also the different priorities. And it doesn't matter if it's, at the OIG, we were talking about this beforehand, that we would be working on our healthcare fraud cases, and it would be June or July, which is coming into the last of the fiscal year, which ends September 30th. And there would suddenly be this recalibration of priorities. Hey, we're low on our grant and child support enforcement investigations. You need to start doing more of those, right? So there's this immediate recalibration to try to work on things that we hadn't been working on all year. So it's like, wait, I have to work on a grant case that I didn't already have open, for which I don't even know how to get a grant case at this point. But that doesn't change at the UPIC. Changing priorities, right? You've got priorities from Medicaid, the Medicaid plans, you've got the states, you've got CMS, you've got special projects, right? So there's this shifting priorities. And then here at Advise, we have 20 different or more, whatever that number is, SIU clients. Each one of them has a different priority, right? As Joe said, some want an overpayment, some want you to negotiate, some want the education. What are some of the things that you've gleaned over 35 plus years of basically juggling different priorities at different times? How do those all kind of work from a managerial perspective?
Yeah, it is a conundrum, and there's like two general approaches to that. One is you try to create a staff of jacks of all trades, that they just get an understanding as they move along as to, for us in the UPIC Northeast, what's the Maryland process? What are the policies there? Do they take it? Do they allow you to do extrapolations? What is their thing versus New York, where there is a step-by-step approval checklist every step along the way? The other is you create specialists. We at the Northeast, we had investigators that just worked in New York or just had 2 or 3 states, so they could get an understanding of, become a subject matter expert in those states, in those processes, what those processes were. And the hiring and the training went to that. And I can give some pretty good examples. You know, it's not just investigators, data analysts, medical review nurses, you know, data analysts, but during the hiring process, they gave a test. You know, here is a spreadsheet, find the aberrations. You know, it had to do with healthcare fraud, but it was just showing, and, you know, Jason, your son worked for us for a while. He took that test. So it gave us an idea of what's the benchmark? Where are they in their skill sets? For the nurses, you know, it was, you know, what is your experience? Have you ever done this? Take a look at this medical record. Take a look at this claim. You know, what's your determination on that? And we would do it, you know, from different states. You know, if you're coming from Maryland, you know, here's a Maryland claim. Here are the policies for that state. And we would then be able to put those people in the places where they were best suited. You know, was it perfect? Absolutely not. But when you're hiring people and training them, on the other side of that push-pull is the expectations of your customers, where CMS or the states say, you know, you've got some criteria you've got to meet here in the terms of numbers of cases that you open and the ROI, although not stated, you've got to have that ROI. So you can't take the time that you think you need to train somebody to the point where, okay, now we can give you a case. It's got to be truncated to the point where they're ready to go with mentoring. So we thought the best way to do it was to give them small bits of scope, let them become experts in that as quickly as possible, be able to identify them through what skill sets and experience they were bringing in, and put them in small areas where they could, you know, they could excel as quickly as possible. So it was, and it was constantly fluid because each state would change their priorities. CMS would, you know, put out their yearly priorities, but then something would happen, whether it's a Senate hearing or an OIG report says, oh, this is an up and coming thing. All of a sudden, all that switches. But it's, you know, it's keeping the finger on the pulse of all that constantly.
Right. Yeah, it's that that prioritization and that reprioritization. You know, this morning there was a press release that was put out by the U.S. Attorney's Office in Puerto Rico. I put something up on LinkedIn about it, and the entirety of the press release was that HHS, OIG, and the FBI are redoubling down on their efforts to combat fraud, waste, and abuse in Puerto Rico. And the thrust of my blog on LinkedIn was, does that mean that the initial work and the doubling down weren't effective, that they're redoubling down? And like, what does that really mean? But I think what it really is saying, now that we're talking about this, is this letting the public know that there is a large priority feeling. And by saying they're redoubling down, they're letting the public know, hey, we didn't go anywhere. We're continuing to work on this. So, Joe, we're getting close to running out of time, and I want to kind of go back to you for this last word, because one of the things that Matt talked about was this specialization, but also this kind of containment sort of premise. And, you know, we've got plans that we do work for all over the country, and some of those plans have really specific sets of policies. Some of them follow CMS guidance. Some of them have their own. You deal a lot with a combination on the commercial side, in network, out of network. You know, how do you, as kind of the senior guy over on that side of the guy, I guess it's politically incorrect, as the senior person on the team that, you know, helps to kind of shape these, how do you work with the rest of the team to kind of make sure that there is that level setting that goes on across the payer SIU world?
I make sure that the investigator has the case understand. First of all, as Matt had mentioned, make sure you give, you know your knowledge base for each of your investigators so you can make them productive. And so you're giving them the correct type of cases. And also like Wade mentioned, you can't give somebody a case on DRG coding if they're a fairly new investigator. You got to start smaller, give them the easier cases. But so know the knowledge base of your investigators and explain to them when the cases are being distributed that this is a commercial case, so you're going to deal with commercial policies only, or this is a Medicaid or Medicare Advantage case, so you can deal with LCDs and different type of policies that are out there. But again, when you're dealing with a commercial commercial customer and the commercial beneficiaries, you have to deal with either the golden standard rules. But again, example would be American Academy of Pediatrics, and deal with those regulations or those gold standards, or you deal with the specific plans, commercial policies on a particular topic. Let's say it's acupuncture. And again, if you have access to this plan's provider manual, you can find things in there that will also back you up when you have to adjust the overpayment or the issues with the provider going forward. I would also just stress that you limit, the SIUs limit the amount of audits that go out there based upon the highest provider for a particular CPT code. I always tell my guys or girls, you should look at, it's okay to look at the highest provider by CPT code, but make sure there's an aberrancy within the claims data. Because a lot of times there is a reason why this provider is the highest paid for that particular procedure code.
Right. No, and that's true, because now if we, we could talk about data analytics forever, but the premise of false positives and the fact that human intelligence has to play an important role in any data analysis that goes on. I always like to talk about that for just one quick divergent second. If you're a general practicing ophthalmologist and you get a retinal specialist to come in and work for you, right? So now that retinal specialist is going to start to bill for procedures and services that you may not have ever billed for under your NPI, right? Your group NPI. You're going to become an outlier. There's an explanation for it, but that's a false positive that needs to be vetted out. So it really is a matter of just understanding what each of those SIUs or each plan is looking for. And you're right, oftentimes there may not be a source of truth, meaning a policy. And so you're going to have to go to one of the academies to kind of get that source of truth. So it really isn't necessarily like in the CMS world, pulling up an NCD or an LCD and saying, aha, now I gotcha, right? There's that gotcha moment may not happen. So great stuff. We can talk about this for hours. SIU management, process improvement, ongoing discussions. We're going to continue talking about that. We're going to start getting back in the next couple of weeks into some specialty fraud schemes and just, keep these conversations going. So Matt, Jason, Wade, as always, good to see you guys. Wade, it's more important to see that you're not wearing a coat. It is now May 3rd in Wisconsin. So it is the snow is now melting. So Godspeed to going out to mowing versus plowing. Joe, thanks so much for joining us, taking time out of the day of doing our SIU work. Matt and Jason, always good to see you guys. As always, if you're not getting our newsletter, you can get it by sending us an email at hello@advize, health.com. You can get our podcasts on our YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and search for Advise Health. You can get us also on Spotify. Please subscribe to either one of those. And you can get our newsletter, which has these podcasts every week. So until next time, we'll see you guys next week. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you all.